Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Geoff Schullenberger, and the Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors each week. This week I'm joined by Ari Gandsman. In 2020, obviously the moment of initial lockdown was very kind of shocking, disorienting. And, one of the perhaps surprising elements of it, as you argue in the piece, is that it offered an opportunity for a kind of attempt at revival of utopian thinking. So, first of all, what was that reaction? Where was it most evident? And who were some of the people who responded in this way?
Yeah, so I think you see it with many, the kind of radical academic left who saw in those kinds of possibilities the tools that we could use to combat, for example, climate change, right? If we could shut down everything for COVID-19 and drastically reorganize our lives, why cannot we not do this exact same thing for the climate change emergency, right? They saw in that some kind of possibility. But you also see it in other forms as well, right? You see people talking about, with a lot of the COVID financial relief, they see in it the possibility of a universal basic income and see that as like a part of the kind of future of work as well, and all the other economic possibilities that are attached to it. So you see amongst people who were long arguing that we are entering end times because of late capitalism or because of the Anthropocene, because of climate change, and thus we need to completely reorganize our lives. And obviously COVID-19 did exactly that. It reorganized our lives. And they saw in that a kind of transformative possibility.
Yeah, and it's worth noting here that, that in terms of the academic left, you had a sort of early schism, which I've written about, between, the first person really to weigh in from that whole world of critical theory is, of course, Giorgio Agamben, who I wrote a piece about earlier this year. He immediately kind of ties it back to concerns he had raised earlier in his career about the war on terror, these kind of new modes of emergency rule. For those of us who kind of lived through that and were following those ideas at the time, there was a kind of strange whiplash. And then you sort of had an instant critical response to him from people like Jean-Luc Nancy, who, and this was really even before lockdowns were implemented much of anywhere beyond China and Italy. You already had a kind of defense of them from other figures on the academic left, even before people had really decided that this was necessary. So that was kind of interesting. But sometime Compact contributor Slavoj Žižek, had a piece, I think the Los Angeles Review of Books, that was called like "Discipline and Punish, Yes Please" or something like that. and so these people had been struggling with, the problem of, that there seemed to be this kind of drift towards apocalypse and this kind of impotence in terms of planning and management and kind of, state projects for reorganizing society had sort of seemed completely out of reach. And so it does seem as if one possibility this raised was the idea that we could return to this kind of, and this is a dimension of sort of utopianism, I suppose, right, is a kind of, if we think back to like utopian socialism, like Fourier, projects of top-down state management of society, which seemed so kind of discredited and made obsolete by neoliberalism, suddenly seemed like a possibility again. So, it's interesting that that's the way that it was received, in part perhaps because, as I said, that if you go back to the war on terror, it's like, okay, well, we did have in that instance an attempt at a kind of top-down reorganization of society around notions of kind of emergency and risk. And, that was not well received by the same people. So there is something kind of interesting in that.
Yeah, there's all sorts of ironies he's out. Agamben is a good example because he gets very quickly vilified and discredited by people who years earlier were citing him and teaching him. And, you see Benjamin Bratton's book, Revenge of the Real, which is a sort of an all-out attack on him, where he's, seen as almost a quote-unquote senile, out-of-touch figure. Even though there's like a brief article in the New York Times, maybe in August of 2020, which kind of lauds him a little bit, or at least and so he is almost seen to be discredited because of his position on the pandemic. Similarly, Michel Foucault's, obviously, his influence on biopolitics on Agamben is pretty strong, is also seen to be whatever the number one academic source of the last 30 or 40 years who suddenly overnight put into question, right? Because of the sort of suspicions that his work brings to the state. And like you said, there's an early saying in the pandemic that nobody is a libertarian during a pandemic. And then suddenly you see a resurgence of a very strong state response. And you see people who had previously been suspicious of the state embracing it. And, there's a rhetoric that, if we had a kind of total control in that panoptic sense, we could have ended the pandemic just like that, right? All it required was 15 days of keeping everyone fixed, right? And that's a public health fantasy, but one that was largely embraced in some ways, even though, right, it runs counter to everything we know about how human beings interact, what are the basic needs of human beings, how economies work, how people need to survive. But there was a sort of base logic that had a sort of fantasy of omnipotent control that is exactly in line with those older utopian fantasies, which required a complete top-down control by the state. That it was completely unrealistic, right, is part of the problem. And that's where, the conspiracy theorists are a little bit funny in that, because people would call Justin Trudeau in Canada a dictator. But the problem in Canada was that we were not, right? We never gave the police the powers that they needed to be given in order to enforce the kind of pandemic controls that a lot of people wanted, right? And part of that is good, right? It was because there was a respect for some basic civil liberties. The one time that the premier in Ontario, I think it's the one time that he made a mea culpa for some of his policies, was when he said that the police should have expanded powers to basically stop anyone on the street and ask them why are they out of their house, because it's a state of emergency and you only were allowed to be out of the house for a particular set of reasons. He had to apologize for that because all these police chiefs rightly said, we will not do this. And their argument was that this is going to be impacting marginalized and racialized communities disproportionately. But implicit with that was almost the argument that if it were not for systemic racism on the part of the police, this would be fine, right? Like this kinds of control handed to the police state would be otherwise not a bad thing.
And it is notable in Europe. These things did go quite a bit farther in terms of police being empowered to, sort of check your papers if you were out of the house and stuff like that. I mean, one thing I have often remarked that I noticed is that, in terms of masking in New York City, you never really actually had to mask on the subway if you didn't want to, because the police were like completely indifferent and never enforced anything. And the same was actually true of the MTA workers. So the only pressure you would face to comply with the mask mandate was from other passengers. It didn't rely, at least in North America, although we could think here of like Trudeau's, use of the Emergencies Act to freeze bank accounts and so on. But, in many ways, a lot of these restrictions relied more on a kind of bottom-up, sort of peer-to-peer surveillance model than on any kind of top-down coordinated control. So it really is the mirror image of the dystopian version, right? They seem deeply invested in the idea of being able to implement this kind of top-down regime that could be used to kind of turn off and turn on, basically treat kind of human beings as inputs that could be, sort of turned off and turned on at will. Even if they wouldn't exactly put it this way. I mean, you did find people, sort of experts, who put it more or less this way, but they might put it in slightly more touchy-feely terms, but nevertheless, that they were kind of invested in this fantasy.
We are all in this together, and that we are masking because we care for others. But of course, if you make masking compulsory, is it really a sign of caring? Because if you care, you should be doing it because you want to, and it's voluntary.
Right, and so this, I think, it kind of gets to the crux of what's so interesting about your piece, because you sort of offer a genealogy of how this particular form of utopianism emerged. And what you show is that, drawing on the work of historian Samuel Moyn, that there's sort of this, that there's this notion, explored by Russell Jacoby and others, that utopia kind of dies in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and, the kind of collapse of grand narratives, to use the postmodern term. And so utopia as a kind of dream is largely kind of abandoned and discredited. but it has this interesting afterlife in the form of human rights, and that human rights becomes, as Moyne put it, the last utopia. So I think this is a really interesting sort of genealogy of where the COVID utopianism came from and how it related to this previous model of human rights.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you see it where at certain points during the pandemic, you have public health experts saying, "Look, we can't call what we're calling for restrictions, even though they are literally restrictions. We need to call them protections." And this is like a Orwellian euphemism, but it's also revealing because protections are exactly that sort of language of human rights, right? That there is a responsibility to protect, which is what has justified logically human rights interventions. And so there is this kind of merging of a kind of public health humanitarianism that's deeply infused with a human rights language. And there is a history of looking at the sort of foundational appeals of human rights that see human rights as requiring a form of what Richard Rorty called condescension, right? That we have to bring these things to people even if they don't want them, right? So we need to protect people even if they don't want the protections, right? We are saving lives, right? And that's the mission that we have, and that's an unbridled good that nobody can argue with, right? Because if you're not saving lives, what are you're causing death. And that's where you see something very similar in the pandemic where, just like human rights is often seen as a kind of politics without a politics, right? A politics that does not acknowledge its political basis. The sort of COVID humanitarian logic is framed by very similar kinds of ideas where you can't disagree with this stuff because it's about saving lives. And it's also not about politics because it's about science. And in the same way that human rights was predicated on a kind of techno-scientific expertise, you see the same similar COVID public health people who are also saying we're just, quote unquote, following the science, as the old saying goes. And that's what's justifying these kinds of policies. And again, both in the name of saving lives. And that's similar to where we are today, where we're just like the human rights interventionists didn't really learn their lessons from all the failed human rights interventions. And what does it mean to bring a kind of top-down approach and bring people human rights protections, right? In a similar sense, the COVID public health humanitarians are still, right? They still believe in their mission, no matter what evidence, right? Just like toppling Saddam Hussein didn't stop people from also using human rights justifications to want to topple Gaddafi. You see a lack of accountability, and a lack of accountability that we know was never there for the war on terror, that is now not here for the people who misdirected our policy responses in such a way that they have created all sorts of terrible backlashes politically, economically, etc. Not to mention the sort of long-term harms that are still unraveling, right? Like I think it'll take years to measure the learning loss in schools, right? And in young children.
It sort of ties into something else I've been interested in, which is the relationship between a kind of moralism and technocracy. You think of technocracy as just being this kind of, I don't know, cold attempt to assess sort of inputs and outputs, and to avoid a kind of moralistic framing. And I think that the history of technocracy is kind of more complicated than that. We published a piece about Auguste Comte, his sort of, a figure who was both the kind of pioneering technocratic ideologue, but also a moralist. But one thing you did see was this kind of short circuit where there's kind of a policy is justified by the intentions behind it rather than by any kind of, demonstration of its effects or of its actual capacity to achieve the things that are being claimed. And so, I think part of what you're getting there is that, if you think of the mood and, what seems to drive these kind of human rights interventionists, right, who, are still wield a considerable, despite the discrediting through, various wars of the past 20 years, still wield a considerable influence. If you think of someone like Victoria Nuland who's still in the Biden administration. I mean, there's also this kind of imperialism to it. And I think, COVID should be seen as kind of an imperial project too, right? Part of what's so striking about it is its universalism, right? That the suite of policies that are rather haphazardly arrived at in early 2020 are actually imposed like almost every country for at least some period, which is still, one of the most shocking things about the whole phenomenon. So it does have this kind of universalism that, we might associate with, kind of bring us back to the war on terror era, this kind of earlier neoconservative dream of bringing democracy everywhere. Well, they didn't succeed in bringing democracy everywhere, but they did succeed in kind of ensuring that basically every country except for a handful, complied with the sort of WHO expectations of what you were supposed to do.
Those are really good parallels, and that's yeah, that it's a part of an imperial project, but one that's seemed to be less questioned, which is what is also kind of interesting when you think of somebody that we mentioned in the article, Bruno Latour, who was previously somebody who was very critical about the construction of scientific facts, but it's exactly those scientific facts that become kind of fetishized during the pandemic and unquestioned, and what Bruno Latour famously called black box, right? Where we didn't quite unpack that, where there maybe was not the scientific consensus about the COVID-19 virus itself, its origins, or obviously the bigger thing, what to do about it. But it was presented as unquestioned scientific consensus on a global and universal scale. And it's interesting, those kinds of parallels, because you mentioned Zizek earlier, and there's parts of Zizek's pandemic book where he starts talking about how the pandemic can be a basis for a new communism, and he wants to invest the power in the WHO, which is a very odd place to put it if you look at all the neoliberal critiques of the WHO. But it's kind of similar to what how human rights activists at some point want to invest all this power in the United Nations, right? Which was obviously a very flawed place to see a model of a kind of new world order, and never quite panned out so well. So yeah, the sort of imperial project is interesting. But meanwhile, it's interesting in the sense that that's the exact moment where human rights themselves become kind of more and more questioned today. Why we live in a post-human rights world is not just because the populist right have rejected the basis of human rights, but also because the left have kind of moved on from human rights, where they're not seen as part of a project that they're interested in. I think of my own students, where when I started teaching like 15 years ago, all of the wonderful idealistic students, and if you ask them what you want to study and what you're interested in, they would all say human rights, or many of them would say human rights. Now the same ones would not say human rights. Human rights would be seen as maybe flawed Western colonial projects, right? Products of white supremacy, maybe. And they would say social justice. They would say that they're more interested in political activism. And it's a different kind of model, right? Like, so if before the idealized student who wants to fight for a better world would say, I want to be a humanitarian NGO worker, right? They're more likely now to say that they want to be an EDI consultant. And again, it is a different kind of framework, which speaks to the kind of fracturing of our world into more kind of identity, grievance-laden kind of politics. But you see that also, right, on the right. It's interesting when you see that there's some political scientists talking about early in the pandemic that COVID-19 will mean the demise of the populist right. It will kill off populism in Europe. But meanwhile, all we've seen since is a resurgence of populism, and even like sanctified figures for their COVID response, like in Finland, right, Sanna Marin, have lost, and they've lost to like the party, they've lost to reactionary nationalist parties, and that seems to be, where things are, which should in part acknowledge, right, to what degree these populist backlashes have to do with the pandemic, or at least its economic consequences, right, in terms of instability and deepening inequality.
Obviously, there's certain figures who seem to suffer, like Boris Johnson, who never really recovered from the effect of the pandemic on their government. The fact that Ukraine sort of replaces the pandemic as the kind of organizing moral emergency. And in some ways, Ukraine, I would say, has posed sort of more serious, or has created more serious fractures in the populist right in some ways. I mean, in the US and elsewhere. But it is interesting that Ukraine allows for a certain revival of this earlier humanitarian and kind of human rights oriented ethos that it's sort of more sustainable than the COVID version. I mean, Ukraine is kind of a different utopia, right? It's the utopia of the kind of back to the expansion of democracy, but it's also conveniently it's happening over there. So for people in the West, it's a more convenient thing to be invested in because ultimately it's mostly dealt with in ways that don't, I mean, ironically, are mostly undemocratic on the side of how governments wage or get involved in foreign conflicts doesn't really have any democratic basis, certainly in the U.S. anymore. It's the dream of democracy once again, but it's also fortunately outside of any democratic accountability. So I don't know, that's an interesting thread here that in a way Ukraine, if it's true that COVID provides this kind of weird both negation and extension of the human rights utopia, then Ukraine kind of keeps it on life support for longer in a somewhat different form.
And it's more predicated on the sort of older ideal of the sort of humanitarian distant suffering. The return to the kind of advocacy by distance, right? The sort of Ukraine flags that fly outside of people's houses, and what those signify especially in terms of what they mean as being a good humanitarian person by supporting the Ukrainian people.
I mean, so Zizek managed to crank out his COVID books like literally within months of the pandemic starting. It's kind of remarkable that you have these COVID books that have sort of come out gradually, and they kind of hark back to this time when there was this idea that the world would be transformed, and that even once this particular emergency had subsided, there would just be some kind of lasting positive impact in terms of infusing society with some greater, I don't know, collectivist sense of, conscience, or some kind of new sense of our interdependence, is a term you discuss in the piece. Do you suspect they will have a sort of academic afterlife, or are they sort of just these weird relics of this moment that, had kind of subsided by the time the books came out? And Latour, who wrote one of them, of course, passed away. We don't know sort of what he would be thinking now. But, do you think this will have much of a sort of academic afterlife, or is it at this point this kind of odd, artifact of the evolution of kind of utopian thinking that, now seems somewhat strange and foreign?
It's a good question. And on one hand, I think there is almost a conscious effort now to forget the past few years. I find when I even just teaching issues around the pandemic, students don't want to talk about it anymore. They live through it. They say they don't want to sort of critically engage with what happened, almost for their own mental health. But it's an interesting kind of question, because I think there are people who saw that moment, and I think you see it increasingly with the rhetoric around climate change and the climate emergency, that there is a kind of an afterlife to that, shall I call it an experimentation of what happened during the pandemic, and how we need to do, quote unquote, something similar. And there it ties in academically, I think, in some ways to the broader, and I think you see it both in Butler's work, definitely in Latour's, the sort of post-human turn in academia of the last decade and a half, which is interesting because it is a premise on a kind of rejection of human rights, because human rights are obviously based on human exceptionalism that is itself a form of an ism on par with all the other bad isms. But it's one that would seem to be part of a kind of a larger project that would stay there, even if it's not implicitly kind of connecting the dots. But it would be interesting to see. I see more like just avoidance of it. And it's almost like those Hollywood movies that are coming out now where they don't even mention that there's ever a pandemic, right? And it's almost odd sometimes when you have a movie that makes a reference to masking or features a mask in it, but it's almost like a joyful forgetting of what occurred. Meanwhile, like you opened with, there are still the same voices, the kind of COVID zero folk who are still pressing for and seemingly embracing in their own lives restrictions indefinitely. In terms of the lived experience of most people, it doesn't really connect. And most people don't want to go back to that. Although, I live in Ottawa, a capital city, where try to get government workers back to offices downtown. They're not back yet in large numbers. I mean, their government is trying to get them back because they now see the kind of consequences of what it means of having this kind of remote work model. But, there was a sort of, again, benefits that this had for a certain kind of class of worker that they want to hold.
Same in New York and elsewhere in the U.S. that, you have this, certainly the remote working is in practice, a sort of lasting situation seems to have kind of permanently changed white collar work. I mean, a final point that doesn't come up in the piece, but that I think is kind of interesting, is the role of China in all of this. Where China is on one hand one of the places where you have a lot of, in an earlier moment, a lot of human rights concerns focused on, the situation of the Uyghurs, focused on Chinese factory workers, the fact that our electronics are coming from these factory, these Foxconn factories and so on. And so then, for various reasons, it seems as if China, by the time early 2020 comes around, that there's kind of this formidable appearance that I think really, again, for various people is very impressive just to see. And I think initially the response to it is really just shock and awe, right? So like the Wuhan lockdown, and it's sort of this like move from like, it's unimaginable that this could happen anywhere else, to actually we need to try to do that, which is sort of an interesting shift. In terms of this intellectual genealogy you explore in the piece, you basically have critical theory, which, with figures like Foucault, becomes critical of Marxism when it's still sort of hegemonic in Europe. And then Foucault himself is sort of actively involved in Eastern European dissident movements. So he not only kind of breaks theoretically from Marxism, but he's actually, unlike people like one of his mentors, Althusser, is like, or Sartre, who's kind of both his sort of one of his models and sort of rivals as a public intellectual, extremely critical of the Eastern Bloc on human rights grounds, right? And he, is involved with the sort of nascent human rights movements. Bernard Kouchner, I believe, who founds Médecins Sans Frontières, who's the really key figures in the development of kind of human rights ideology and human rights utopianism, is a friend of Foucault's. They collaborate on things. And so you have this evolution, it involves this criticism of communist authoritarianism and this active involvement in protests of, against communist authoritarianism. Then you have a complicated history of both figures trying to, kind of continue that more kind of, I suppose, small L libertarian critique of state power in the kind of line of Foucault. And then, figures like Zizek and a few others who want Badiou and a few others kind of in critical theory who want to at least, not entirely throw the communist legacy out. And so then, what's interesting is you have China, which is a nominally communist country, a very complicated one. But certainly a country that is not averse to, even as it's engaged in kind of hyper-capitalist development, is also not averse to, gargantuan projects of state planning, and, is sort of, literally kind of building entire cities out of nothing in a decade, and, is building new, high-speed rail lines. And, what's interesting about China before the pandemic is it's kind of, I've thought you could go around the whole political compass and you can find people who are impressed by it in every camp, right? The sort of left communists will sort of at least appreciate the aspects of it that seem to continue on the promise of the Chinese Revolution. There's kind of a libertarian appreciation of the Chinese economic model and its use of special economic zones. A right-wing free market appreciation of it as a state that's really just invested in ensuring that capital thrives. And so it's very odd. Like, it seems like you can kind of go around and almost everybody can find the China that they're sort of envious of. And so what's odd is then somehow when China models the lockdown, which is something that's never really been recommended, has been explicitly cautioned against by the WHO and other major public health authorities, does it, and supposedly because we can look at these graphs and see a line going down, it's this great success and everybody should do it. So, there's something about that moment, both in the way it captivates seemingly everybody, but then how it also maybe fits into this kind of intellectual genealogy of this complicated turn away from state planning and communist utopias of old, and then towards human rights, and then it's as if this kind of triggers a weird synthesis of the two.
I hadn't thought of it, but that echoes a lot of debates in the 1990s amongst human rights circles, where you have East Asia's "quote unquote" objections to human rights on the grounds of communitarian ideologies, right? So they object to the individual basis of human rights and say that human rights don't "quote unquote" fit here, right? And from an anthropological perspective, we criticize this as being very reductive and stereotypical, right? But what you see is a resurgence during the pandemic of a lot of public health liberals in the West sort of fetishizing what they see as a sort of communitarianism in China, which they see as the reason why there's such widespread compliance to public health measures, right? And we only see later that the COVID zero policy was built on brute police force, right? And then the internal protests that finally led to an almost overnight dropping of that policy, right? Which had to be inevitable at some point, but they kept it as long as they possibly could at great harm, at a huge descent to the government that was almost unforeseen, right, historically, and now we see it with the complete economic chaos and the crisis that is in China, which are based on the cumulative effects of these kinds of policies, which have, I think, led people to kind of rethink their views of China, right? I mean, it's an interesting one in light of the sort of conspiracy theorists who thought that this was a CPP, orchestrated thing for whatever reason, right? But what you do see more is sort of incompetence and unexpected effects from trying something that was completely novel and had never been tried for such duration at such a large scale. And that's the exact moment, right, when China institutes lockdowns. You see all of these public health commentators in Canada and the United States who are quite critical of what China's doing, who worry about its human rights consequences, who say this is untested, who say this has never been done. But what's interesting is that within a month or two, they're all in favor of it. And so they have this complete about face. There's no reason why, except that suddenly they've kind of converted to it. But yet those same people have not come to terms with that and have not said maybe that was a mistake. And you don't see that on as large a scale. I think there are people who maybe admitted a few errors here and there, but not to say that we got it wrong and that this response was maybe not the right one.
Where Latour has this odd kind of insect model, right, which is ironic in relation to this whole the dystopian discourses that I mentioned previously, the live in the pod and eat the bugs kind of notion of where this is leading. But it is weird in that it kind of ties into, as these sort of Oriental. I mean, I'm not accusing Latour himself directly of this, but it does tie into these kind of Orientalist ideas about the East, and the societies being more like these kind of hives, and that that sort of in some sense becomes the new model of utopia that these academics kind of become captivated by, which sort of echoes then these kind of cruder, as you said, kind of idealizations that you find among, where this kind of Orientalist vision of collectivism and, collective effort and sacrifice is kind of fetishized and fantasized about by, these sort of Western experts.
Yeah, and that's where you start seeing, right, how freedom becomes something that becomes increasingly questioned and something that's a term that only the right is using or associated with the far right. I mean, obviously you see this in Canada with the Freedom Convoy and how it is kind of understood and perceived by both the media and by the government. And yeah, exactly that sense of, we have to de-individualize, which is what Butler and Latour connect on. And that is the only way we are, going to survive, is how they would see it, which, for a lot of us is quite an unfortunate model as we see as it plays out elsewhere, or in the metaphors that Latour uses, which are interesting from an academic point of view, because they're quite close to what was originally, conceptually speaking, Latour's enemy, which was like the sociobiologists like E.O. Wilson, who also saw us like
right.
We were completely de-individualized and controlled by our biology, right, which is not a word that we would use today, but Latour almost reclaims that argument in a debiologized sense, but as almost like a good moral sense of the term.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very peculiar, actually. The weird reversion to this kind of sociobiological fantasy that, would have been robustly rejected by all of these people kind of when it was first promoted. And, would have been seen as a right-wing model, right? By all of these people in the 70s and 80s. So just one final thing, which ties back to something I asked before. So do you think, with Ukraine having in some sense replaced COVID for the moment as the kind of organizing crisis, do you see Ukraine as, in some sense, also keeping this human rights utopian vision on some kind of strange life support?
I'm no expert on Ukraine, but there was that interesting moment early on where Biden started speaking openly about regime change, right? About how Putin must go. Uh, but he seems to back off from that rhetoric, at least in public statements. And it was an unwise statement at the time. But it is part of that question that's still out there: that are we still committed to that same kind of model, and what does that mean? And I think as you see in the news now, right, more people to say what is the strategy in Ukraine, what's the end plan, right, where it just seems like there is just endless and atrocious suffering and death, which is very much within the kind of human rights model, but a question of what to do. The earlier points would be definitely based on a kind of regime change model, right, of a kind of direct human rights interventionism, but it was never on a scale of a power like Russia. And that was always where the constraints and limits were. And you see that within human rights interventionism at the level of the UN Security Council, right, where you had certain powers that could use their veto powers to stop any kind of action, right, which is why often these sort of interventions had to be done unilaterally.
Yeah, no, I was shocked by, there was a cover piece in the Atlantic magazine by Jeffrey Goldberg and Anne Applebaum, both of whom I think I'd identify with the kind of human rights utopianism come sort of neoconservative interventionism that, kind of has had a dominant place in kind of the bipartisan foreign policy consensus. And I found it quite shocking because basically it was weird because it happened just before the sort of aborted Wagner group coup, or this was published, but it was like, yeah, it's fine if we just topple Putin, even if some brutal strongman replaces him. It's still better because, Putin is just too powerful and he's too, totalitarian in his ambitions. And, if we replace him with somebody kind of more small minded, then it'll be less of a threat or something like that. And I was like, this is just, these people really learned nothing from Libya, and just the incredible catastrophe that, perhaps more than any other of these interventionists. It's hard to equal Iraq, but, it's just the catastrophic effects of that intervention are still playing out, but they still just think you can do regime change and it'll all work out.
Similarly to COVID, if you look at the Atlantic's coverage, and I guess maybe there's an interesting parallel there on the other side with what Harper's has been publishing, because their last few had an article on Ukraine which was fairly critical of that, and they also have had recently a cover article on COVID science wars, which has also been quite critical in terms of how we approached it as well. So yeah, maybe intellectually there's a sort of a symbiosis there.
Yeah, no, you're right. That there is kind of a opposition playing out between those two sort of venerable magazines, which I guess means at least that the realm of magazine publishing is not entirely caught up in a monoculture. so that's something. Beyond compact, of course, which is apart from any monoculture. But I'll let you go. But thanks so much for taking the time and for contributing this great piece. It really, I think, illuminates where the kind of, particularly the academic left's kind of embrace of COVID authoritarianism came from, and how it followed from previous trends. And it's, I think, an essential kind of piece of intellectual history for the past few years.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
So that is all for this week's Compact Conversations. As always, remember, Compact is a reader-supported publication, and we need your subscriptions to keep doing what we're doing. Please check out Ari and Jose's essay. It is paywalled if you are not a subscriber. please go to compactmag.com/subscribe. Take out a subscription. You'll be able to read this and many other excellent pieces. Also, if you like this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating on your favorite platforms. Thanks so much, and talk to you next week.